everyone. I'm very excited about our COO panel today, where we are going to talk about the role of COO, how to define the role of COO, when the right time to hire a COO is. I am excited that we have some amazing leaders, operators with us today who have all at one point or another sat in the COO seat. Maybe we'll start with you, Meghan.
My name is Meghan Joyce. I am the CEO of a stealth startup, but I was most recently COO and EVP of platform at Oscar Health.
My name is Caitlin Donovan. I'm currently the global head of health at Uber, but in past lives have been a COO.
I have been an operator in fintech for over 2 decades, as well as a board member.
My name is Adrienne Gormley, and I have a long career working in many different tech companies.
Stepping into the COO role, did you spend time with the CEO prior to joining, really articulating and sort of working out what are the responsibilities that you're going to have and what are you going to own and sort of what is it going to look and feel like? Or was it like, let's come in and just kind of figure it out on the fly? Or how did you sort of decide what the role was going to mean and look like?
I'm happy to start. So I think, honestly, Leah, it was a bit of both, but I don't think you can, at least in my case, skip either. I think aligning upfront on the expectations was so critical for my CEO and I, and even at Uber with my manager there and I, because what you don't want is someone who comes into the role wanting to do something different and not excited about the scope that you've laid out for them. And so I think as honest and candid about the scope and the challenges and the opportunities as you can be, the better, because the reality is every job has hair and you want to find someone for the role who likes that version of hair that you are bringing to the table with this role. And, the right person is going to run towards the kind of challenges that you need them to tackle. And so I think the more you can actually lay out what you are hoping for, what you are envisioning, the kind of work that you as the CEO don't like doing that you need this person to pick up, the areas of the business that really need help and organization or management, leadership, cleanup from this person, the better.
The context you gave, Leah, around how often your portfolio company CEOs are asking you this question, I think is because of how wide-ranging this role can really be. Depending on a combination of the industry you're in, the company you're running, and the skill set of the CEO, I think the expectations can be wildly different, which really changes the profile of the person you might be looking for. So both as the CEO looking for a COO and as a COO looking to have that role, I think it's critically important to align on the expectations really up front. But then just like Meghan said, I think all of us have been part of high growth companies, and the nature of a high growth company is you're building for the future, not just keeping the trains running on time. And so the expectation that things will shift is paramount to successfully accelerating your growth from Series A to B to C to beyond.
I think what I've observed throughout my career and also in N26 is that the role is a mixture of a job spec and a role definition that you kind of go through as a CEO. I think we need something like this. I think the various conversations and discussions beforehand in terms of aligning and understanding what is actually needed in the business, how do the founders or the CEO, how do they think about the role? What do they need? What gaps do they have? Or what are the problems that they see in their growing organizations? So I think there's partly discussions beforehand. And then, as always, when you come in and you get into the role, the reality then unfolds. And I think one of the key things from a COO perspective is the ability to be as agile as possible, to understand the dynamics of what is actually going on in the business. Where does the CEO really need help? Where does the executive team need more cohesion or alignment? And where can you best play? And that can be very different depending on the organization, depending on the CEO, depending on the COO as well.
Yeah, and my situation definitely spent a lot of time with the CEO kind of outlining, really, what he wanted to continue focusing on, really where he felt the weaknesses were with the rest of the executive team, and their focus areas were XYZ, but, this is where I feel like there's a gap. And I think typically in these growth stage startups, a lot of the founders, are very product led, vision oriented, and they really don't want to spend a lot of time kind of like dealing with like the day to day of running a business. Right. And with that kind of orientation, and then looking and seeing, okay, what is the rest of the executive team really focused on and where are their strengths? You can really figure out pretty quickly where you can slot in. And I think, for me at least, in addition to spending, a lot of time with the CEO up front to outlining the responsibilities, I also did spend time with the rest of the executive team and just really getting their input on where they felt, the gaps were in the day to day and where they would sort of prioritize my time and focus. And certainly, have, I feel like I'm, very strategic and have a lot of input. End of the day, there's a founder, a CEO who is really making the call. So you have to be comfortable being in that position.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I think that I used to hear that a lot from folks who would say it's so important to know that you're hiring, if you're hiring a COO, to really know that the person's coming in to do that job and not to do the CEO's job, because when that's the case, it can get really ugly pretty quickly because you're sort of battling to do the same job. We've talked about this like independently. I know each of us sort of in the past, but there's a right time to bring in a COO, and then there's probably not, right? Like I think certain companies, maybe it's not the right time, certain stages. You guys have each sort of stepped into the COO role at various times and sort of life cycles of a business. Having seen this a couple of ways and a couple of times, like, do you think that any time is a good time? Does it just depend on the person? Or do you feel like fundamentally maybe not every business is ready and maybe there are things that we can kind of help founders learn in terms of what are the questions they should be thinking about or asking to know if it's the right time? Because I imagine that's a really hard thing as a founder to figure out, like, do I need this role and why do I need it now?
So I've seen COOs come in at earlier stages and be very successful in accelerating the growth of a company. I've seen COOs come in at later stage and be successful. And equally, I've seen COOs come in at those stages and be unsuccessful. And I think when I look behind the success versus unsuccessful, one of the key things comes down to that trust relationship and that ability of founders or CEO to say, I am ready to take on someone, empower them, and give them the authority, delegate certain things. And by the way, those certain things should be the things the CEO, I think, as said before, doesn't enjoy. And get a yin to your yang is really how I think about that.
So what we found is I formed a really, really tight relationship with our chief technology and chief product officer so that we could say, what's our ultimate goal? What does it look like if we do it with only operations, no tech? What does it look like if we do it with only tech, no operations? So that we could really decide how to best use our resources to accelerate into our fundraise. And we found that to be really, really successful at jumping ahead in our momentum. I think for some more traditional businesses where the operations are a little bit more around people management. Am I saving a little bit on the cost side? I'm not sure you necessarily need a COO. You need more really great VP of operations that knows how to lead a team, has that management experience and can rally the troops behind them, but doesn't necessarily have that strategic edge. Just so that you save a little bit on costs and can focus your budget in other areas.
I would add maybe there's a strategic difference between that kind of what you can get away with a VP of operations and a COO. I also think you keyed in on something that I've seen great COOs do, which is drive those cross-functional connections, both at a strategic level, but also from a leadership and alignment level. And Samantha, I love your quote around COOs are world-class followers. In a way, I also think COOs have to be world-class leaders in the sense that they need to lead without being the person in front all the time. There are moments where they're kind of leading from behind, leading behind the scenes, bringing people together, driving alignment among that kind of key leadership team under the CEO. And ideally, you want your VPs doing that for sure. But when I've seen companies shift to the moment where they say, gosh, we really need a COO in the mix, is where there is a kind of coordination and alignment function missing at that senior most level, where the CEO needs a strategic thought partner who's willing to do the legwork of going from function to function and building the relationships and then getting all of those different pieces and organizations aligned around hitting the key mission. And so in addition to everything, Caitlin, you said, I think having the need for that leader on your team can be another signal that you really need to bring in someone quite senior and thoughtful who can grease the gears of the rest of the organization in an effective way.
Totally agree. I mean, at some point, you get a level of complexity in your business, your product suite, your staff, whatever those complexities are. And yeah, as COO, you are the exec that's in charge of orchestrating what is probably a very nuanced ecosystem, right? And you can, I think as a CEO, we'll probably start to see those things breaking down before a COO can come in, right? To your point, Meghan, is everyone aligned around the strategic priorities? Where are the silos forming? Where is communication breaking down between, product and engineering and go to market? Whatever it may be. And sometimes those things can be resolved with a chief of staff type hire or a VP of operations hire. But I think, there is a kind of a level at which you say, okay, wait a minute, this is actually now complex enough that you need somebody who is a very experienced operator, who can lead from behind, who can bring people together, make sure everyone's steering in the right direction. Yeah,
if you could craft, so take the position or take a specific position out of the picture and a specific experience. But if you could personally craft kind of your ideal perfect COO scenario, if there is one, but if you could, in the sense that in your mind, this would set up a business for success if it was done this way, is there a perfect way to sort of craft this, or is there a perfect sort of time? And should the CEO be sitting there saying light bulb goes off, I'm thinking this way, and now I know I need this person, and I should be spending my time on these 2 or 3 things and let someone else do these things? Or is there if you could craft it perfectly, is there even a way to do that? Maybe this is a silly question, but I'm sure you guys, when you stepped into the role at various times, you kind of built it with them, but at the same time, there were specific needs already. So if you took those needs out and you were just let me craft this from nothing, is there a perfect way to do this, I guess?
Absolutely. I think it can grow very complex very quickly in organizations that are growing extremely fast, hiring a lot of people. There's new people and more new people and new leaders and so on. And so having someone who can, on the one hand, be very systematic, who can build out, this is the cadence of how we are planning, how we're thinking about strategy, how we're translating that into quarterly objectives and key results, for example. But also then partnering with the CEO, who is usually the visionary and kind of, I want to go here, and helping to translate that vision into practical milestones, the reality of what needs to happen. And really, I often think of a COO as someone who's trying to remove the obstacles, both from the CEO's perspective, but then also from the executive team and the broader team, to enable them to deliver what they need to deliver.
I think the ideal role in my mind is one where the COO has a clear line of direct ownership and authority. And maybe that's over just operations, maybe it's operations and some other functions, but they are also empowered to kind of drive alignment among that first team. And yet the CEO still has the accountability over those other functions, because you want your COO to have deep relationships where they can influence their peers effectively, but that ultimately you as the CEO are holding them accountable for their own work and their peers accountable. And I think, to your point, where those roles of CEO and COO tend to get muddled, one area I've seen is around accountability. You really do need the ultimate leader of the business to drive accountability across her or his direct reports. And I think, in my mind, the ideal world is where that COO is empowered to go drive alignment, form deep relationships, execute on their own areas of responsibility, but where you, the CEO, are willing to ultimately align with the COO and drive the accountability across the business, such that when they are influencing, they have the kind of two-sided efficacy of that partnership in moving the business and all of its functions forward.
So a couple ways to do that are also potentially, putting together. We actually did that through kind of revamping our quarterly planning process and our OKR process and, our business review process, because then when everyone sort of understood, like, this is how we were going to work as an organization. And this is, myself and the CEO kind of making sure that we were aligned with how this was going to sort of go on, what the cadence would be. Then everybody starts to really sort of get into that rhythm. And it really, really helped, as to your point, Meghan, the CEO was still able to drive accountability, but I was kind of greasing the skids, right? To make sure that everyone was coming to the table with the things that were needed for strategy execution.
I might add one more thought on what are the leading indicators of when you need that and when it's clear that that you as the CEO can no longer reach as far into the organization to successfully align folks. And in my observation, it's two things. And Samantha, I think you just said one of them around quarterly planning. Sometimes if you get big enough, you end up with really strong, VP level, director level, advocating for themselves and their team, but without taking a step back to say what's best to prioritize across the entire company. And I think that's a really good indication that you might be ready for a COO. And similarly, I think Samantha or Meghan, one of you said this originally as well. When do you see those silos form? So I know when and I think that is when you are hearing bubble up of finger pointing. So often see that in a go-to-market team, for example. I sold this. Why hasn't the account manager implemented it? Why hasn't product executed? I think that's a great leading indicator if you might be ready to bring someone in to align those disparate groups.
And that should be a big focus of the COO, right? Is around decision-making rights. How are decisions made in the organization when you come into the role? What needs to be optimized? Can you get the CEO? And which is, and a lot, I think most of our cases, there's a founder CEO, which is even a different dynamic around decision-making. So there's a lot of work and lobbying that needs to happen. But at the end of the day, if you get it right, it really can speed things up tremendously. That's
super insightful, but also a really good segue, because one of my questions was going to be, how do you, if you come into the role as COO, how do you ensure that the rest of the organization doesn't immediately reject this idea of COO? And then I guess the other piece of that is, as the CEO and founder, how can we assure CEOs that it's okay, this can work, but there's probably a method to maybe doing it that will lead to everyone being successful? Because I've seen a lot of times there is organ rejection and it doesn't work out. And, the person steps in for 8 or 9 months and it's like, listen, it's not worth the battle, or, so if the alignment somehow isn't there. And I feel like that can be really tough for an organization to take. And so trying to avoid that from happening has to be an important part of bringing on a COO, because it is such a key role for the business.
I mean, I think it starts just with listening, right? I mean, as experienced operators, strategic thinkers, it can be really tempting to come in and you sort of immediately try to prove your value. And, but if you don't really understand what counts as value, then, you have to get the context, right? And, look, in my situation, I was on the board, so I felt like I knew the business. I felt like I knew the team, but coming into the operating role, there's still a learning curve. There's still a lot to learn about the dynamics, about the decision-making rights, just how things get done. And so, investing upfront and just listening and building that rapport with the CEO, I think goes a long way to preventing, as you said, that organ rejection.
I also think I completely agree with that. And all of those typical tenets of change management, however many you can make work in the midst of running the business and growing and scaling quickly, are so worth the investment. So, explaining as the CEO to the company, not only the what exactly this person is coming in to do, but the why, and saying that unapologetically. The business is getting bigger and more complex, and you as the CEO have a critically important job in fill in the blank, whatever that is, setting the vision, liaising with external parties, whether that's from an investment perspective or a go-to-market perspective or otherwise. Really thinking about the strategy and having the headspace to do that. That is all critically important.
The one thing that I'd add to that is how you as COO builds trust with the team and what to test for there. And the two things I look for there is someone who has a history of giving credit when something good's happened, but taking the fall if something didn't go as well. And also someone who's willing to lean in early for the major pain points that are typically the reason they were brought in.
I think on the characteristics for success, I think trust is essential. And I think the relationship between the CEO and COO needs to be built on accelerated trust. And in many ways, I would say to both CEOs and potential COOs, that also should be a really big part of the interview process in terms of understanding each other as human beings and people who style of work, style of communication, types of way you get mad and get frustrated and how that manifests. And I think understanding these and articulating these can take an awful lot of emotion out and really accelerate that building of trust.
Who should be part of the decision to make to hire a COO?
I think ultimately at the end of the day, it has to be the CEO's role or in making the decision that you need a new member of your executive team. If the CEO is bought in, that is going to be a disaster for the company and the person coming into that COO role if their boss is not excited about having that person in seat. But I do think that, like any major strategic decision in a business, and key hires are major strategic decisions in a business, the board can help influence that. The leadership team can help influence that. And the idea may come from anywhere, right? It might come from the operations team. It might come from the rest of the executive team. It may come from the board. And by the way, as the CEO, you should be leveraging those parties, both for advice and thought partnership, also recruiting. Those folks have great networks. And if they can bring someone into your pipeline who they've worked with in the past or seen in action, that increases the likelihood of success and in having that person be effective once they're in the seat. And in terms of bringing the rest of the executive team along, soliciting their input on that can be a great part of change management. And making it clear that this is not a veto right they have. No person has veto right on the hiring of their peer, but what are they looking for in a partner? And where are the gaps that they see, as Samantha mentioned earlier, I think can be a core part of the change management process and in the thought partnership to get the scoping and person right.
Yeah, look, of course, the CEO has to be bought in, but I do think that it is going to be incumbent upon the board, as well as potentially the advisory board, to kind of help identify the need. Having the connectivity to the CEO and kind of understanding what the challenges are in the business. Especially if it's a first-time founder who maybe has not had the experience working directly with the COO, it may not be something that is, feels comfortable. So I would say, for the board to lean in and kind of make sure that, they're asking the right questions. And it could be, hey, start with the chief of staff, bring somebody in that gives you some operating leverage, that can be an extension of you, that can handle special projects, and do some of the things that a COO would do. And then if that experience is good, then I think the CEO can see, okay, wait a minute, this is something that really could add value to the business and really help me be a successful, CEO and leader of this organization.
That's a good idea. Sort of work into it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think there's an interesting upfront conversation when the board is selecting a CEO, where I've had a couple of experiences where in giving references for a CEO, I've been asked by the board member that's doing the reference check, what type of COO will this CEO need? And so I think pre-planning ahead so that you can set the whole company up for success over the appropriate timeline is a good practice.
That's good advice. Is there why does it usually not go well?
I would consider two things. And to be clear, I've been lucky to have great experiences personally. So I have been very lucky to work with phenomenal CEOs and founders. But the two things that I've observed are, one, the minute every decision or too many decisions get questioned, that's just the sign of a deteriorating relationship. And the second thing, I think, is more advice to new CEOs or new founders. There's a bit of intestinal fortitude that comes with being a COO around understanding what is a priority, what is really important, et cetera. The more your company scales, the more problems there are, and having that trust that they know when to bubble things up given their experience versus they know when to just handle on their own, I think is really critical in preserving the relationship and keeping the company running at the right pace.
Yeah, Caitlin, I think that's spot on, both of those things. And I think the converse of every decision needing to go to the CEO is the CEO not actually driving decisions or accountability where they need to, and not empowering that work somewhere else in the business. So it's fine if the CEO wants to delegate authority elsewhere. But if it's not delegated and it's not happening, or if the accountability is not delegated and that's also not happening, that can cause that kind of first team thing to erode. And in instances where I've seen that happens, the executive team can get significantly distracted with trying to angle for what's right for their function rather than what's right for the business. Mm-hmm. And so I think, going back to these themes that we've been talking about the whole time, if the CEO is not willing to drive that accountability, not willing to set the expectation that that team needs to work together to solve the major problems of the business, that's where I've observed things start to deteriorate.
Yeah. I guess just two things to add there. I want to, emphasize the trust, factor in the relationship between the CEO and the COO. I think it's something that, really does need to continue to build over time, and constantly be reaffirmed. But in practice, when you're in the day-to-day, a lot of it goes back to having a very robust operating model, specifically that sort of quarterly planning process where there's a lot of clarity around how priorities are kind of confirmed, how they're communicated to the team, the things that, the team's coming back and saying, this is how I'm going to, help execute against that priority or OKR. This is what's not in focus. So there's a lot of clarity. And then the CEO can come in and say, okay, yes, I agree with all of this, or I disagree. And then alignment happens. And then it's really just go, right? Then everyone's executing against that. If you don't have that framework in place, that robust framework in place, things can deteriorate.
I think in the first 90 days or the first number of months in the role, one of the key things that and I find it difficult to this day is to not be too active, is not to do too much. Because as operators, and it's really incumbent, we want to come in and we want to start changing things. We've seen this before, but the biggest gift you can give yourself as a COO is the gift of curiosity, and ask, why is something like that? It's very easy to come into growing companies and let your jaw fall to the floor and go, oh my goodness me. And so I think it's very important to ask, why is that way? What happened in the past? Who made the decisions? And again, not blaming, just for your context and for your understanding. And I can say that if you do that for the first number of months, you obviously, I should say, have to get some small wins under your belt. But before any big changes, really peeling back the onion and understanding why it is the way it is. And I guarantee what you thought you were going to do on day one is not what you will do on day 90. And for that, people who have been there, it doesn't matter how senior or how junior, will appreciate that you understand the business. You're not just coming in with your super track record from company X or Y. You're actually coming in to listen and to see, okay. And along the way, you will be able to identify quick wins. So I think that's also and it's very difficult, but you have to just go hold, don't action, ask a few more questions, meet a few more people, and then go, and then put your plan together.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm taking notes, but I think the themes that I'm hearing are, sort of the message around this, the kind of key messages like accountability, setting expectations, communication, trust, alignment, having a really clear framework, doing some upfront work before you just jump into this decision to hire a COO, like really making sure that this is a thoughtful, sort of well thought through decision if you're a CEO and founder. And, maybe it's hiring a chief of staff first, sort of testing it out if you're not sure, but really, ensuring that these things are kind of key themes in the relationship for it to be a positive and successful one. Feels like some really good things for folks to think about, because at the end of the day, it's really easy, I think, to just sometimes say, someone said I need a COO, so I'm going to go hire a COO. Or, 5 other companies did it when they got to this size, so it feels like we're ready to do it. I need a COO. Or, like a million other reasons why I've heard. But, it's like there's always something. But you're sort of like, well, let's step back a second, right? Like, let's make sure this is the right decision. Or if you're not quite there, let's talk through why you think you're not there and sort of figure out ways that we could set this up for success by working on some of the things we just talked about, which I think is key. Are there other questions you think are helpful for people to ask CEOs going into this relationship before we wrap up? Or there's other things that, like good way to sort of make sure it's the right thing for you as a COO?
Absolutely. But I think it's something that as a CEO, when you're thinking through, do I need somebody and do I need a COO and what kind of COO? This difference of I need a VP of operations rather than a COO. That's one of the questions to really put to yourself is, if I'm going to hire somebody who's challenging me, then they're going to challenge me. And are you ready for that? Even in your own psyche, are you ready for that? Is the team ready for that? And you don't need a hellraiser. That's not what I mean. But it is somebody who is going to question and challenge, ultimately with the good of the business in mind.
One thing could possibly be, asking the CEO if what the vision is for, 2-3 years out, right? Is it, hey, let's build out the team, build functional leads or business line leads or whatever the structure is in the organization to the point where, a COO is potentially no longer needed? Or is this, more of a, hey, I need a number two that's potentially a succession plan down the road? Do they have any early thoughts on the trajectory of this role? I think that could also help with alignment in terms of, your personal interests and desires for your career development, as well as the needs of the business, going forward.
Great.
I'd add two more comments. One is very similar to Samantha's point. What is the overall strategy of the business? But also, what's the investment thesis, right? Because so much of where you decide to spend time will be dependent on what your board thinks, et cetera. And therefore that changes what you prioritize as a business. And the second thing I'd consider is, when you interview someone, sometimes you get the stock answer that makes a lot of sense. I do think there's a lot of value in teams that have worked together before or doing a lot of references around how someone acts in real situations. There's a certain team from circulation. I would do that in a heartbeat because I know that what that CEO likes is what I dislike, what she dislikes is what I like, and it was a perfect marriage. And so preserving that team can go a long way in thinking about your growth.
The one specific thing I would look to really truly understand how it works in practice is how the CEO resolves conflict and how the COO candidate resolves conflict, because this is not a role for the faint of heart. It's not a relationship for the faint of heart. And there is going to be ideally constructive conflict on a regular basis. And there may even be counterproductive conflict from time to time, either in that relationship or between others among the team. And really understanding how those two people can work together to resolve that is going to be critical for the relationship, because you're going to want there to be a creative tension and a push and pull there, and for that to be able to resolve itself in a constructive way and not one that creates stress and strain on the relationship or the business.
I love that. Yeah. And Caitlin, you used the word marriage, which I think is a great word as well to describe the relationship and sort of expectation setting, that this is sort of like that, right? And so there will naturally be conflict. Not all great, but it will be sort of, it will be messy at times. You sort of have to expect that. But, if you really respect the other person, you've kind of worked through these things, ideally you come out still married at the end. So I think that's a great point, Meghan, because being able to really identify how people handle conflicts and making sure that feels good to you is a big part of a working marriage. So this has been amazing. I really appreciate it. You guys are awesome. This is so much fun. And I just think, I don't know, I feel like it's been, I feel like I've been toying with this sort of notion of like COO. What does COO do? Are we, when do you need it? How to coach CEOs and founders on the right time, how to make sure they feel good about it, how to make sure that when we bring COOs in, it is a successful marriage. Like, I just feel like it's been, 10 years of talking to folks about this stuff. And there's just, this is like, there's so many ways to think about a COO, but everything you just talked about here, I think is so valuable for founders and CEOs to hear, because these are great questions for them to ask. And it doesn't mean it's right for everybody. And it doesn't always have to be right now. And not everybody is going to be right for, a specific CEO. But if it's something that, if it is the right time or you think it might be, then being able to think about some of the stuff we discussed today and really think about, setting it up for success with the right expectations and communication and everything else is going to be so critical. So, I think this is just so valuable, and I really appreciate you guys making the time. And I'm glad everyone has had really good COO experiences. So could be the alternative, but I'm glad we're talking about it in a positive light.
And thank you so much for having us, Leah. This was a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.